Good morning. Sorry it's taken me so long to get to the Settling the West lectures. For those of you who actually watch them. This is kind of like the Cowboys and Indians theme of American history. So we're kind of like looking at, I guess if you think of like old Westerns and things like that, that's the kind of stuff we're going to be looking at. We're also going to be looking at like Sand Creek Massacre, Battle of Little Bighorn, the Dawes Act, a lot of skirmishes between American Indians as well as the white settlers who are moving in on their territory. So we're going to take a look at some of that as well. So we start off with mining because it played a really important role in settling the American West. Basically, after the Civil War, the demand for minerals goes up like drastically because instead of farming so much, because in the South they don't have slave labor to run their plantations anymore, they try to switch more to industrial. So we start to kind of like advance in society a little bit as far as like industrialization goes. We're still in the same time period as like Civil War and Reconstruction. We're just looking at different aspects of that time period. So mining in the West also encouraged the building of railroads. And so people would connect the mines that are out west to the factories that are out east so they can transport goods from one point to another without having to take a 3-month-long trip on your like horse and buggy to get somewhere. So with the development of a lot of new like minerals or trying to find minerals and becoming an industrial nation, we get boom towns. Because basically, if one town, strikes gold or they strike silver or, there's some sort of precious metal, then everybody is going to start rushing to that town. And then eventually you have like hundreds of people living in this one town, and people start setting up like you have hotels, you'll have a saloon, you'll have barbershops, things like that. And like little frontier towns would turn into small cities. And so they call them boom towns because they just pop up out of nowhere. And just as fast as they pop up, a lot of times they would like disappear because if like the gold or the silver or whatever mineral that they're mining starts to kind of like chill out, or they stop hitting as much, then people start leaving and they move on to the next town. So the boom towns would go bust, and then you would have a ghost town. So in the boom towns, it's really like lawless. You don't have like a sheriff or anything. Law and order is enforced by vigilante committees where you have like volunteers who would track down and punish people who had done wrong things. And so you have a lot of like people getting away with crimes, a lot of crime going on regardless. Women, they work as laundries or cooks. They work in hurdy-gurdy houses. Hurdy-gurdy is an instrument, kind of like a Western. It's actually like a medieval type instrument. It probably sound familiar if you'd heard it, but I've got a picture of it on the next slide. So some women even become property owners and community leaders because they, they just run these towns while the men are out mining and stuff. The women are back at home or back in the towns running the towns. So here's your hurdy-gurdy, and you've got keys on the side, and then you've got a little wheel, kind of like a little handle here. And basically you just like turn the handle and hit your keys, and it makes a really neat sound, really cool musical sound. Here's one of our ghost towns here. A lot of times these towns would be even like put up for like movie sets. They're not even really like, legit Western areas, but you might have like some towns that pop up specifically for like Western style movies. And then after the movies finish filming, they just like kind of leave it. And some of these have turned into like tourist attractions. So mining obviously like leads to statehood because a lot of times whenever you get these boom towns, you get more populated cities, and you get more railroads and things like that. And it really it leads to a more developmental friendly kind of like state. So you've got Leadville, Colorado, where you find $1 billion in silver and gold. A lot of other boom towns in Colorado as well that lead to building railroads through the Rocky Mountains. That obviously makes Denver into like a super city. It's the second largest city in the West. Denver and Rio Grande Western, South Park and Pacific, and the Colorado Midland all made stops in towns in the mining region. So they have railroads like crisscrossing all through, and that's why, like, Denver is still a pretty big, popular city today. Gold's also discovered in the Black Hills in Dakota Territory. Dakota Territory was supposed to belong to the Native Americans. Long story short, whenever gold is found there, it's kind of like, oh, well, we said you could have this territory, but we're going to need it because there's gold here. Copper is discovered in Montana. Silver is discovered in Tombstone, Arizona. All these towns just like pop up out of nowhere, all because like people start finding these like precious metals. Tombstone, you've probably heard of. It's known for its lawlessness, and there's like a movie about Tombstone itself. This is where Marshall Wyatt Earp and his brothers gained their reputations in like this big gunfight at the OK Corral in 1881. So that's kind of what that movie is about. If you hadn't seen it, it's not bad. Pretty interesting. So for like mining technology, so there's different types of mining. You have like mining where you extract minerals through in shallow deposits, using picks and shovels and pans. That's called like placer mining. You also have what we call sluice mining, where you would go in the riverbeds and you would like pan through the water. You might divert part of the river into like trenches and then get a metal box and just kind of like shift through to see what metals fall out once the water has kind of like ran through. The riffle bars will cause the heavier metals to settle on the bottom of the box. You can kind of decipher the metals between like just dirt and stone and stuff like that. Miners also began hydraulic mining, and they would do that to remove a lot of the earth. Like basically they'd spray like high water pressure against like mountains to get rid of dirt, and then once they had done that, they could like get into the mountain and kind of like dig for the minerals and stuff. But the problem with that was that the water pressure would wash away like gravel and rock, and it would cause like a lot of like mudslides and stuff like that. So because of that, like you get millions of tons of silt and sand and gravel that gets washed in local rivers. Like the sediment would raise the riverbed and rivers would overflow, cause major floods. You'd get fences and orchards and all kinds of stuff like destroyed. Farm soil would be ruined by gravel. Basically, it would ruin like a settlement, like if you do that in a particular city, like over and over again, that settlement is going to eventually suffer. So, in 1893, they decide like, okay, this isn't working out. Like we're ruining our environment. We've got to kind of chill out with this. So they create a law that says that if you're going to use hydraulic mining, then you have to have a place to store the sediment that you wash away, because if it runs off into a riverbed, it's going to overflow the river and cause problems. And so a lot of people started doing that. Quartz mining is probably the most popular, or probably the one that you have heard of, or like you would be more familiar with. I think of like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. It's the kind of mining that you dig deep shafts in like mines, and then miners will go underground and extract minerals that way. So here's an example. So this mine in Montana, when it closed, like there are some negative effects here. The water had passed through mineral deposits and created like a really acidic water source. And so like people can't use that water because it's contaminated with like chemicals and stuff from like where they were mining. And so people were supposed to clean those up in like 2018. Here's another mine. This is one of the largest mines in the world. It's actually the largest man-made excavation in the world. So it's 2.5 miles wide and then 3/4 of a mile deep, and it supplies nearly 15% of all the copper used in the United States. So this is the Kennecott Copper Mine in Utah. So along with mining, people also make money out in the West through ranching and cattle drives. So, home on the range. This is kind of where what that's referring to, like the open range. So Texas Longhorns had adapted to the harsh conditions of the Great Plains, and that was the type of herd that a lot of these men would ranch and take care of and sell to make a profit. So that's the beef that a lot of people were eating. Beef prices go up after the Civil War, and ranchers start looking for a way to round up longhorns and sell them to Eastern businesses because they want to make money. The goal is to get cattle all the way from Texas to a railroad line up north so that they can be sold for a profit and then shipped east where they would be consumed. So ranchers would meet with their cowboys. They'd round up cattle from the open range and start on the long drive. So you would have in one big herd probably stock from like 10, 15 different owners. And so they would put their brands on the cattle so that if their cattle, like once they made it to the railroad, you would know who had which cattle that had made it because some of them would die along the way. So they would check the brands to be sure that that was that they were getting plenty of cattle there and they were going to make some money. That was your way of knowing that you had a few head of cattle that had made it to the railroad. So cowboys drove millions of cattle north from Texas to Kansas. Sheep herders moved their flocks onto the range. Farmers settled there, blocking the trails. Range wars broke out between the groups for competing land. So the sheep herders and like the range, the farmers like kind of fight over the land, the open range, because cattle and sheep don't really like go well together. So these range wars eventually cause problems. People start squaring off the land instead of like just letting it be open range. People use barbed wire to square off pieces of land for themselves. So for cowboys, the barbed wire ended the adventure of the long cattle drive, and investors started pouring money into booming cattle business. It caused an oversupply of animals because people were like, "Oh, beef is great. Let's put some money in here. Let's put money into it and make sure that we've got plenty of cows so that we can make some money off of it." And then because they overproduce, they oversupply, the prices drop. So then the cattle industry survives. Obviously, we still eat beef. It's important, but there's no more open range, and it's just not the same. So the Great Plains had no timber and little water for settlement as well. A lot of railroad companies sold land along the railroad lines for low prices because it's like, hey, where at least you know that there's a railroad coming through your land. And so the railroad companies would actually make money from that. That was how they got money to pay for the railroad, was they would just sell the little pieces of land on either side of the railroad and make a buck. That was how they made a profit. So they would do that and provide credit to prospective settlers. A lot of pamphlets and posters spread the news to city dwellers across Europe and America that cheap farmland was theirs to claim if they were willing to move out to it. They would always say, rain follows the plow. So if you come out here and start farming, then rain will come. It'll be fine. You'll be able to grow crops. So a lot of people kind of buy into that, and they start moving out west. People from Europe come over. They start moving out west because, hey, we got a chance at getting our own land and making some money. So the government would encourage settlement through different acts. In 1862, one of those was called the Homestead Act. Basically, if you were 21 and you were the head of a household, you could pay $10 filing fee and $2 commission to the land agent to be given 160 acres of land. To gain title to the land, you had to live on it for 5 years and develop it, basically. Build a house, clear it out for farming. If you didn't want to do that, then you could buy land for $1.25 an acre for 6 months, after 6 months. So obviously that's going to bring in a lot of people too, because it's really cheap land. And an opportunity to have your own farm, have your own plantation. So then we get the wheat belt. So new farming methods and machinery results in great amounts of wheat production. You have a lot of dry farming where you would plant seeds really deep into the ground where there was moisture for them to grow. And like you use a lot of things like plows and seed drills, reapers, threshing machines, things like that. A lot of sod busters would lose their homes because of the drought and the wind erosion and overuse of the land, because like once you farm it so often, the ground becomes really like loose. You get dust storms and things like that. So during the 1880s, many farmers in the Midwest moved to the Great Plains to take advantage of the inexpensive land and like all the new farming technology that was out there because of new opportunities. So the wheat belt began at the eastern edge of the Great Plains, and it encompassed a lot of the Dakotas and part of Nebraska and Kansas as well. New technology allowed single families to bring in thousands of acres of wheat. So instead of having to have a whole slew of like slaves to run a plantation like you had in the South with like these cotton farms or like these other plantations, now you can come in with just your family, just, husband and wife, kids, and whatnot, and create, have hundreds and thousands of acres of wheat and take care of it and no problem because of all the new inventions. You've got wheat is like a lot easier to kind of like deal with. It's not as hard to grow. Like people are, looking for making some money basically from this. So the bonanza farms start popping up, and they're basically 1,000-acre wheat farms that yield big profits. Obviously, like it's just your family mining and taking care of everything. So like your family gets all the profit. Bonanza farmers formed companies. They would invest in property and equipment. They'd hire labor if they needed it. A lot of times, you're pretty good with just your family, but you see a lot of these pop up over time. So here you go. You've got your plowing on a bonanza farm. Here we go. And you've got your like horse, your different horses carrying on here. Everybody just kind of gets in a row and they're able to like farm, like I said, hundreds of acres. It's hard work, but by golly, it's a lot easier than having to do it by hand. So the U.S. becomes the world's leading exporter of wheat until we get this severe drought in the 1880s. So the drought obviously causes problems because you do have to have a little bit of rain for wheat. But farmers mortgaged their land so that they could pay their living expenses because they weren't bringing in any money from their crops. Those who could not pay back their mortgages had to forfeit their land to the banks. And then they would start working as tenant farmers on their land that they used to own to the new landowners. So basically the banks would take their property back, sell it to someone else, and then they would just work for the people who had bought it from them. It's rough. The Oklahoma land rush is considered like one of the last large territories for settlement, and that was on April 22nd, 1889. More than 10,000 people raced to stake claims in the Oklahoma land rush, and that was kind of like the last open frontier. In 1890, the Census Bureau had reported there wasn't really like a true frontier left in America. There wasn't like large plots of unoccupied land. Like there was still land, but and new settlement still comes. But we call this kind of like the closing of the frontier, and this is kind of like the end of an era. This is the end of the time. Like obviously, there's no more like, oh, there's so much land out west, so we can just move out there. Like, it's not like this American dream anymore. It's kind of like falling flat because so many people have already done it. So the quote at the end, it says, "The real story of the West was not one of limitless opportunity, nor one in which heroes rode off into the sunset. It was about ordinary people who settled down and built homes and communities through great effort." So, that's the American dream, really. Like being able to settle down, take care of your family, have money to support yourselves, and make a good living. So I'm going to stop here and I'll record and pick back up on the Native Americans next week.